Hi students. I just want to talk to you a little bit about the comic competition that I'm launching here. I have a lifelong passion for comics. I've been reading comics practically since I could read. When I was 6 or 7 years old, I started reading Tebeos in England, the comics like the Beano and that. And then as I got older, it progressed on to things like this. This is a comic which is very, very long running in England, in the UK. 2000 AD. The character you see on the front is very, very well known in the UK. They've made a couple of films of this character, Judge Dredd. But I see the date on this comic here. My goodness, I must have been about 15 years old when I bought this with my pocket money. But this is the kind of like science fiction, stories, different worlds, monsters, robots, androids, fantastic sort of stuff. And I've always enjoyed this kind of comic. Within it, a good thing about this comic 2000 AD is, some of the stories were just purely fun, but a lot of the stories had a sort of like serious message in it. I did think they had some sort of moral to them, and there was one story in particular that really inspired me when I was a child, and the artwork of this person, Kevin O'Neill's, and the script was by Pat Mills. So Pat Mills wrote the story, Kevin O'Neill did the picture. I was very, very aware, I think, anyway, maybe not as much as I am now when I read this again, of how this was a story about racism. Basically, it's aliens versus humans, and the humans are the baddies. The humans want to kill all aliens because they see them as disgusting and horrible and impure. And you have this leader, this character I just always wanted to know how to draw, but it's very, very complex, Nemesis, who is kind of like the leader of the alien rebellion. Pages like that, just like, wow, just like blew my mind a little bit, and this is it. This is where it all started, my love of comics. Now this is, as I say, this is more fantasy based, and I still like this kind of stuff, but I don't read comics like this very often now. I tend to read stuff which is more based in reality because I can kind of relate to it. It doesn't mean that I don't like things like the X-Men, Spider-Man, etc., but I don't know, I think there's more scope with comics. Some of you might have seen this, maybe your parents have got it. And if you haven't heard of it, I seriously recommend it. This is possibly the best example I could show you of how autobiographical a comic can be. It is not about something fantastical, it's not science fiction. This is a story of a couple from Valencia, Cristina Duran and Miguel Aginer Bous. Their child, the little girl, is born, and at the birth there's complications, and she's born with sort of learning difficulties, and they're in the hospital. This is great, this book, because it actually talks about places I think it's the hospital of the Passet or La Fe, I can't remember, and here they are receiving some bad news about their daughter who's not in the it's really, really heavy. I must admit, when I read this, I was quite emotional at the end of it. I won't tell you the end, I'm not going to spoil it for you, but look, you've got this black thing descending on them as the reality is hitting home about something. It is really, really beautiful. They've done a couple of other graphic novels. I think the second graphic novel was about the adoption of the second child from Ethiopia. And more recently, they published a graphic novel about the metro train accident, which I think was 2002. I can't remember. I haven't read that one. Yeah, but really, really good. And as I say, very different style of drawing, but not dealing with fantasy, dealing with something very, very real. Another one in that category. Now, again, this is very, very famous. It has sold so many copies, this. I've even seen a copy of it in the school library, in the new building. It is brilliant. It's about a little girl growing up in Iran, and she grows up in one sort of cultural climate, and then they have the Cultural Revolution, when the sort of dictatorship starts taking over, and suddenly she is obliged to wear. It talks a little bit about the history of the country. And the style of drawing as well is quite sort of like simplistic in sometimes, but this is something I want you to consider, because I sometimes think the artwork is not as important as the script. Yeah, sometimes I could be really impressed by the artwork, but I don't know, the story doesn't have much substance. Anyway, as the story progresses in here, she's sort of like obliged to wear the Muslim headscarf. And eventually it goes to being more about that. She actually grows up, becomes a teenager, and it's about a young girl just discovering herself and living through quite difficult times in her country. It is a really good read. They made a film of it, Persepolis, which I recommend as well. It won quite a few awards because it was really, really faithful to the comic. They didn't really change anything at all, and the artwork looked exactly the same as well. Okay, another one. I'm going to show you a couple more. Okay, this is another really, really realistic one. I couldn't believe that Chris Ware, the man who draws this, actually does it without a computer, because sometimes it's just so precise and complicated. You know, you read these pages and think, oh my goodness, what's going on, what's happening? And there's loads of sound effects in his comics. Sometimes they're very, very quiet, and and this is a really brilliant read, but it's incredibly sad. This one's called Jimmy Corrigan, the Smartest Kid in the World, and it's about a little boy growing up and discovering things about his past and his family in Chicago. As I say, they're so precisely drawn, these things, and sometimes so repetitive. I was convinced that he did it with the aid of a computer, but I recently saw an interview where it explained no, he doesn't. And it's quite autobiographical. You feel like he's describing real people and real places and real events, which I think is what the competition is about that I'm proposing. Another one that definitely is a biography. Now, I didn't know much about the man, Steve Jobs, but I did after reading this, and I never really bought into the whole Apple thing. I got my iPad and I thought, wow, this is really, really great, but I didn't know much about Steve Jobs. And this is another good example of how I don't think the artwork maybe is as important as what's being said. It's got a really good story. It talks about, well, his life was just, there was a lot more to it than I was aware of. I had no idea, for example, about his involvement with Pixar. You know, when you see Toy Story films and you see Vaiana and all these films, Steve Jobs has a huge part in setting Pixar off, and I did not know that. He spent a lot of money on it, took a big chance. I'm halfway through this one at the minute. This is just like unbelievable. Look at that. This guy has an enormous imagination, and I was in FNAC in Plaza San Agustin in Valencia. Just saw this in Spanish, and I thought I've got to get that in English. And it was just the opening few pages. You have these birds, look, reading there. Sure, I'm getting sick of these seeds. I know what you mean. Hey guys, hi. Anything good today? Same old thing, I guess. And these little birds are quite philosophical. They think deep thoughts about things, and as the title of the book suggests, ask big questions about life. And as the story sort of progresses, there's a plane crash, there's an unexploded bomb, the birds think it's an egg. You know, it's pretty surreal actually in some places. It's quite strange, some of the things that happen, but it's just, I don't know, this is what I like about comics. The last one I'm going to show you, just one more. If you ever get a chance to read this, this is another one there. I was not entirely convinced by the artwork at the beginning. It didn't look like the kind of drawings that I usually like. But it's a story about young teenagers sort of growing up, first relationship, and separating actually. Well, maybe I'm spoiling the end of it for you now. But it's about real stuff, and There's some pretty hard moments in this book that this person must have had to deal with in their life. But it's beautiful. Yeah, particularly I love the scenes where they start drawing, he starts drawing, Craig Thompson, the trees full of snow. I don't know if I'm going to find that in this moment. Anyway, listen, I'm showing you this because usually when I talk to people about comics, they think of Mortadelo and Filemon. They think about Tabeos, Pipi-Thape, and yeah, I mean, that's another whole thing to it. It is. But I think comics have a lot of scope to express a lot more things than just making people laugh. I mean, a serious comic can have funny moments in it, but I'd like you to consider that you try and do a comic of just a small moment, maybe something that's happened, or you know, just your experience of what's happened in the last 2 months whilst we've been living in lockdown. Okay, I'm really looking forward to seeing what you do. Remember, you can work in pairs. You can have one person writing the script and talking with you about ideas, and the other person working on the images. The minimum is 6 panels, which means 6 little vignettes. And it can be done with any material you like. It can be digital, it could be hand-drawn, it could be painted. As I've shown you with these comics, I mean, comics does not mean one particular thing. That's another one over there they've got. I haven't read that one yet, but gosh, it looks good. I'm really excited to see what you do. Okay, bye-bye.